Et cette séance pour un certain nombre de raisons. La première étant que si le WAC existe, et je le rappelle, c'est dû à la volonté de coopération et de collaboration entre des chercheurs, des universitaires qui sont des deux côtés de l'Atlantique, des universitaires ouest-africains, en particulier sénégalais, dans les années 90, ont bien voulu conjuguer leurs efforts, mettre en commun leur savoir et leur capacité de mobilisation avec des universitaires et chercheurs américains, dont beaucoup sont des spécialistes de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, qui ont écrit des livres sur l'Afrique de l'Ouest qui sont des références, que ce soit dans le domaine des sciences politiques, que ce soit dans le domaine de l'histoire. Et ces gens sont mis ensemble pour mettre en place une organisation jumelle qui s'appelle la WARA-AROA, West African Research Association, Association de recherche ouest-africaine. C'est cette jonction entre ces deux associations qui a rendu possible l'existence du WAC, qui est une organisation dont le fonctionnement est assuré par des subsides qui nous viennent principalement de l'autre côté de l'Atlantique, mais la contribution ouest-africaine est là dans la mesure où ces installations que vous avez ici, si vous venez au WAC, il faut bien que vous traversiez une porte là et que vous vous installiez quelque part. Cet espace-là, ça fait partie du patrimoine bâti de l'État du Sénégal, et c'est le président Abdou Diouf, le gouvernement du président Abdou Diouf dans les années 90 qui avait fait, si vous voulez, honneur à la tradition diplomatique du Sénégal et a donc offert un siège au WAC, qui est l'institution chargée de mettre en œuvre la politique de la WARA et de la ROA dans le domaine de la recherche et dans d'autres domaines. Dans ce cadre-là, la personne avec qui je travaille tous les jours, que Dieu fait, de temps à autre au téléphone, mais régulièrement avec l'ordinateur et l'Internet, c'est Madame Dr Yanco, ici présente. Je vais donc vous présenter Madame Yanco brièvement. Je crois que cette présentation, Jennifer, ne se fera pas de manière académique, en ce sens que si la présentation que je vais faire respecte cette norme-là, le personnel a tenu à dire un mot. Donc à un moment, et je crois que peut-être Dieu aura un micro-baladeur là-bas, un représentant du personnel aura à dire un mot. Alors, Jennifer est un collègue, mais en même temps un ami. Je crois qu'on travaille, et je le lui dis souvent, je crois que si je n'avais pas comme répondant aux États-Unis quelqu'un comme Jennifer, qui connaît très bien l'Afrique. Alors si on dit qu'il aime l'Afrique, ça fait un peu néocolonialiste. Oui, c'est un Américain qui aime l'Afrique, c'est un Français qui aime l'Afrique. J'aime pas ça. C'est pas ce que je veux dire. C'est quelqu'un qui vit l'Afrique intensément et honnêtement et véritablement. 10 ans au Niger. 10 ans. Avec un sac plein d'argent pour aller payer des enseignants dans les écoles les plus reculées du Niger. Linguiste, mais linguiste spécialisé dans les langues africaines. Et qui tous les jours insiste pour que, quelles que soient les possibilités d'action, les possibilités d'intervention de la WARA et du WAC, que l'on fasse la part belle à l'Afrique de l'Ouest par rapport aux questions sur lesquelles on doit faire des recherches et aux chercheurs ouest-africains. C'est ça, Jennifer. Donc, si je dis que c'est une partenaire qui m'a convaincu à rester, parce que mes étudiants sont là, ils savent que des fois je suis un peu difficile. Autant j'ai le sourire facile, autant des fois, peut-être qu'eux-mêmes, ils ne me reconnaissent pas. Bon, je ne peux pas dire que c'est des principes, c'est pas ça, c'est ma nature. Mais il y a certaines conditions sous lesquelles je ne travaillerai jamais. Voilà. Mais il y a certaines conditions sous lesquelles je travaillerai toujours. Et ces conditions-là, je peux dire que je les ai avec Jennifer. On travaille beaucoup plus en tant qu'amis qu'en tant que des gens qui ont, n'est-ce pas, un travail à faire et des résultats à donner. On le fait spontanément, sans calcul, de part et d'autre, mais il y a surtout les relations de respect et d'amitié qui soudent et qui renforcent notre travail. Et je crois que s'il y a une qualité dans le travail que nous faisons, je crois que c'est cette complicité sincère-là qui en est le résultat. Ce que je le dis très souvent, que je fasse quelque chose qui ne lui plaît pas, tout de suite elle me le dit. Qu'elle fasse quelque chose qui ne me plaît pas, je crois qu'avant qu'elle se réveille le matin, j'aurais pris mon téléphone et je lui aurais dit. Elle m'a fait honte une fois parce que je l'ai appelée, mais je ne m'étais même pas rendu compte de l'heure. En fait, il faisait 7 h du matin à Boston, il faisait terriblement froid. Elle m'a écouté religieusement, poliment comme elle sait le faire, mais elle m'a dit, Ousmane, est-ce que tu sais qu'il est 7 h du matin? Tout de suite, j'ai changé. Jennifer, pardon, mon ami, je ne savais pas qu'il faisait 7 h, pardon. Et bon, ben, la conversation s'est tenue, mais dans une autre atmosphère. L'autre côté de Jennifer que vous ne connaissez pas, aussi, et qui est le prolongement de cet engagement-là, c'est que quelqu'un qui s'est impliqué fortement aux États-Unis pour qu'il y ait quand même une conversation entre les races, pour qu'il y ait un brassage entre les races, hein, et depuis 1999 et bien avant ça, elle est engagée dans ce genre d'activité. Elle a fondé par exemple une communauté éducative, un programme d'éducation communautaire qui s'appelle White People Challenging Racism, Moving from Talk to Action. Des blancs qui s'attaquent au problème du racisme et qui voudraient aller de l'action, de la parole à l'action. Because as you know, action speaks louder than words. Elle a été, je ne sais pas si vous ne me dites surtout pas que vous ne connaissez pas, parce que sinon vous ne risquez pas d'avoir votre Master 2. Hein? Elle s'est engagée comme membre du NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, aux États-Unis, et elle est responsable d'une section et elle travaille de manière très suivie et très active dans ce domaine-là. Mais ne l'oublions pas, elle a eu son master's à la prestigieuse école de Harvard School of Public Health. Il faut avoir quelque chose là-dedans là, pour pouvoir entrer dans cette école-là. C'est là où elle a eu sa maîtrise. Et aussi, elle a contribué à écrire un livre qui est resté célèbre, Our Bodies, Ourselves, qui s'occupe de santé, mais de la santé aussi du corps. Et elle a joué un rôle extrêmement important dans la publication de ce livre-là. Elle a eu son PhD en linguistique et actuellement enseigne à l'université de Boston. Sa première activité, c'est directrice de la WARA, mais elle donne des cours à l'université de Boston et a pendant longtemps été aussi professeur visiteur de linguistique à l'université Abdou Moumouni du Niger. Actuellement, elle est la directrice de la West African Research Association, mais je ne vais pas le rappeler, je crois que tout le monde connaît son engagement par rapport à ça. Alors la raison pour laquelle nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui autour d'elle, c'est que pendant longtemps, elle a éprouvé le besoin de dire quelque chose sur le mouvement des droits civiques et en particulier de parler de Martin Luther King. Alors le titre de son livre montre bien qu'on n'a pas compris tout le message de Martin Luther King, où on n'a pas fait honneur à tout le message de Martin Luther King et à son héritage. C'est pour ça qu'elle a écrit ce livre-là, qui à nouveau n'est pas encore publié sur papier. En février, ça va... Oui. En janvier, ça va sortir sous forme électronique, mais plus tard, la version papier sortira. Et peut-être, il y aura quelque part une traduction qui fera que, bon, on pourra présenter Howard aussi bien une deuxième fois et une troisième fois la version française et la version anglaise. Le livre, dans sa version finale, s'appelle Remembering Dr. King, Revisiting the Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. C'est donc de ce livre-là que Mme Yanco va vous parler aujourd'hui. Mais je crois que je l'avais dit au départ, ce ne sera pas une présentation intégralement académique, parce qu'il y a une dimension, si vous voulez, professionnelle et émotionnelle. Et j'ai l'impression que le personnel du WAC m'en voudrait si je ne leur donnais pas quelques minutes pour qu'ils aient leur mot à dire par rapport à leur relation avec Jennifer Yanco. Et soit Ablaï, soit quelqu'un d'autre, je vous donne la parole pour que vous puissiez dire quelque chose à Jenny. Je vous remercie.
Je voulais tout juste dire quelques mots, je ne vais pas être long.
Vous voulez dire que j'ai été long?
Donc je crois que l'assistance n'est pas là pour m'écouter, donc l'assistance est là pour écouter Dr. Yanco. Donc pour quelques mots, au nom de tout le personnel, pour dire quelques mots à l'égard de Dr. Yanco. Nous nous appelons tous ici Yaïboy. Et quand on dit Yaïboy, vous comprendrez le sens qu'on veut utiliser pour symboliser les relations entre une maman et ses enfants. Donc, Dr. Yanco représente pour nous une maman, pour plusieurs raisons. Parce que je crois qu'il y a une affection qu'elle montre, il y a un certain amour à l'endroit du personnel. Elle a un sens de l'humain, un sens du partage, une générosité exemplaire. Je crois que les mots ne suffiront jamais pour qualifier Dr. Yanco, comme je dirais aussi que les mots ne suffiront pas toujours pour exprimer ce que l'on ressent envers une personne. Je crois qu'elle est tout pour nous, en dehors du cadre professionnel. Je crois qu'elle a beaucoup contribué, elle et M. Sen, à nous façonner dans le milieu professionnel, mais aussi dans la vie de tous les jours. Je crois que je veux parler plutôt pour mettre l'accent sur sa générosité. Elle ne peut pas venir à Dakar sans apporter des cadeaux à tout le monde ici. Pas plus tard que hier, elle est venue avec des cadeaux pour une collègue qui n'est plus parmi nous. La regrette de Mankoumondoi, elle vient toujours avec des cadeaux pour ses enfants. Et elle nous a quittés depuis 3 ans. Chaque année qu'elle vient, elle amène des cadeaux pour ses enfants. Je crois que ça c'est remarquable et il fallait le noter ici. Je crois que Yanco, en dehors de l'aspect scientifique et académique, est une autre personne. Et je ne peux pas le dire ici de manière exhaustive, afin que vous puissiez savoir qui est Yanco, mais sachez, je voulais témoigner ça au nom de tout le personnel, qu'elle est une maman pour nous. Donc, en dehors de cet aspect professionnel, nous avons autre chose entre nous et qui est très profond, je voulais le souligner ici. Merci encore, Yanco, pour tout ce que vous faites pour le personnel du WAF, tout ce que vous faites pour l'institution, mais tout ce que vous faites pour la communauté des chercheurs de la diaspora. Merci encore. Je voulais tout juste lui souhaiter un succès pour ce livre qui va sortir bientôt, mais aussi profiter de cette fin d'année pour vous souhaiter une longue vie, une santé de fer, mais aussi réussite dans toutes vos entreprises professionnelles comme familiales. Merci encore. Je voulais tout juste en guise de reconnaissance, au nom de tout le personnel, lui remettre ce certificat. Je ne suis pas fort en anglais, je vais essayer de dire, ou bien pour que l'accent soit mis sur le terme.
All right, okay, so this certificate says the West African Research Center, one, present this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Jennifer Yanco, Wara Director, for her commendable leadership and earnest dedication to Wara Works mission in West Africa and guidance to the center's staff. Awarded on December 11, 2013, and signed by the work staff representative Abdoulaye Nya, and countersigned by the director of the West Africa Research Center. So this is the certificate given to Jennifer. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe we should be applauding to this. Picture, yeah. Okay, I'm going to add to that gift something which is precious to me. That's my mug. Voilà, c'est pour boire mon café, mais bon, comme le personnel lui a offert quelque chose et moi je n'ai rien à offrir, je vais lui offrir ce mug-là avec lequel je bois du café. Mais je vais c'est symbolique. Inside is white, outside is black. So, you know.
Merci.
Ouais, on va te mettre du café là-dedans tout à l'heure.
Ok. Merci beaucoup. Il faut dire que je suis un peu bouleversée par toutes vos remarques. Et je suis bien reconnaissante de pouvoir travailler avec une équipe qui est si sympa et si professionnelle.
Il paraît que les étudiants ont parlé de quelque chose, je ne le savais pas. Elle le dit.
C'est une surprise.
Maintenant?
Ouais.
Well, okay.
S'il vous plaît.
Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Ok. Je vais parler. Ok. Bonsoir tout le monde. Je m'appelle Yanco et je suis la responsable du centre de présentation du WAC. Et je voulais dire un très grand merci à Mme Yanco. Mais je ne trouve même pas les mots pour le dire. Car Dr Yanco est une personne très gentille. Et c'est une personne également à la générosité très manifeste. Merci à mon professeur, mon directeur national, parce que la conjugaison de ses efforts avec Dr Yanco et l'ambassade des États-Unis de Dakar a fait que le WAC, et particulièrement la bibliothèque, est devenu un endroit beaucoup plus favorable à la recherche. Mes remerciements vont également à Stéphanie Durand. Elle n'est pas là, mais je tiens à la remercier. Parce qu'elle est toujours derrière moi quant à la page Facebook du WAC. Donc, vraiment, je tiens vraiment à la remercier. Et pour terminer, je voulais vous dire que par ma voix, les enseignants, les chercheurs et les étudiants vous ont préparé quelque chose de très symbolique. Parce qu'ils m'envoient vous dire qu'ils n'ont pas d'habit pour vous donner, encore moins de l'argent. Mais ils ont leur preuve pour vous témoigner leur reconnaissance, leur gratitude pour tout ce que vous avez fait, vous et M. Sen, pour la bibliothèque. Et comme M. Sen a l'habitude de dire que le WAC est une famille, et que moi je tiens beaucoup à la consolidation de cette famille, je voudrais que mes chers collègues et amis, M. Abdoulaye ici présent, et M. Andridien, qu'ils donnent les cadeaux au directeur, pour ainsi partager le prix de mon travail.
Vous voyez le trésor que je vous donne ça?
C'est magique.
Look, guys, je ne veux priver personne. Est-ce que dans la salle, il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui voudrait dire un ou deux mots? C'est une cérémonie, bon, à nouveau académique, on présente un livre, mais en même temps, il y a cette dimension relationnelle. S'il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui veut dire quelque chose, autant le faire maintenant, d'autant plus que je vais vous minuter. On ne peut pas aller au-delà de 18 h là. C'est bon? Bon, allez, Jennifer, vous avez la parole.
C'est pour moi aussi? Aïe, aïe, aïe. Je suis tout à fait dépassée. Merci tout le monde. On ouvre? Il ouvre. So I'm going to start to talk a little bit while we're opening. But Jen, can we listen to the music again while we're opening? Oh, this is... ça serait très difficile de présenter parce
Bon, je vais vous dire ce qu'on va faire. On va encadrer ça et on va mettre ça soit dans les bureaux ou dans la bibliothèque. Pas dans les bureaux.
Oh, merci beaucoup. Ça, c'est vraiment un bon, encore une fois, mes remerciements. I'm actually going to speak in English, perhaps a little bit of franglais. And if there's something you don't understand, I'm happy to try a translation. Un petit mot en français, mais comme le livre est au sujet de la distorsion, si on peut le dire, et non seulement l'oubli, je risque de faire une distorsion aussi si je parle en français. So, the music that was playing a moment ago, only some of us in the room probably recognize it. It's by Franklin Bukaka, and it's called Les Immortels. And I asked Jeng to play it because I wanted to speak a little bit about the context in which I'm presenting this book. And that is the context of the passing of Nelson Mandela. And immediately when I heard that he had died, immediately the words of Franklin Bukaka came to me when he says, can you put it on again just in the background? When he says, it's a song about various liberation leaders in Africa and throughout the world, including Malcolm X, including Koulibaly, Abdel Kader, Mehdi Bambaka, and many heroes. And at one point in the song, he says, un vieux que je considère toujours jeune m'a dit un jour, tout homme doit mourir un jour, mais toutes les mortes n'ont pas la même signification. And that's what I thought of immediately when I heard that Mandela had passed away, and knowing that he would have also been part of this song. He is a great hero and a great visionary, and I think that people the world around will miss him a great deal. And as I thought about Mandela and read, there's been a lot in the press of his words, I saw such striking similarities with Dr. King. A passion for justice, a passion for a world without the corrosive powers of racism, a commitment to nonviolence at all costs, and to social and economic justice. Both of them have lived through their lives a great commitment to building a world at peace, and the only way, both of them said, we can attain peace is through the pursuit of justice. So although Martin Luther King Jr. will always remain a rather young man for us, he still had a great deal of wisdom to share. And I think his kindred spirit, Nelson Mandela, who had the good fortune to become a wise man and an elder, we will miss a great deal. My fervent hope is that when it comes to Nelson Mandela, no one will feel the need to write a book like the one I'm going to talk to you about. I felt compelled to write about Martin Luther King Jr. because I feel that we haven't remembered him. May the memory of Mandela be one that continues to be honored by our efforts to realize the world that he urged us to create. I certainly don't hesitate to say that presenting here at WARC is a great honor and a pleasure for me. WARC has been an important part of my life for about 10 years, and I had visited WARC well before that also. It's become a family and an intellectual community And I'm always impressed by the sense of intellectual exchange and free discussion that goes on here. Another reason why I'm really glad to be able to make this first presentation here is that I have the distinct impression that most of you may remember Dr. King better than my compatriots at home. Because when I mention to people that I'm writing a book on Martin Luther King Jr., people begin to quote him here, and there seems to be a much stronger and more accurate memory. Can you put the first PowerPoint slide, please? Yesterday there was a conference here on presenting a book by Professor Chun on 3 Senegalese novelists facing history: Abdoulaye Yeliman Khan, Boris Diop, and Sheikh Amadou Khan. It was noted that in all of their works they present communities that serve to show us that another world is possible, and that it's up to us to build that world. So, of course, since what I'm thinking about most of the time now is Martin Luther King Jr., I thought of, his quest for the beloved community. This is something he talked about a lot. And again, a community guided by principles of justice, compassion, and nonviolence. In this sense, I think Dr. King would be in good company with his Senegalese literary kin. Yesterday, at the close of the conference, historian and former dean Abdousso Fastaf underlined the importance of remembering, the importance of not forgetting history. So, do you have the first slide, which is the cover? We can just leave that for a while. So that's why I wrote this book, to try to counter the forgetting and the distortions in remembering Dr. King that have seemed to plague us in the United States. So it's a rather curious thing. I'm a linguist. I have a background in public health. I'm an administrator as the director of WARC, so why should I be writing a book about Martin Luther King? I'm not really a scholar of King. At least I haven't been until recently. But the opportunity was presented to me by a major press in the US to write. And so I immediately thought, that's what I want to write about. It was in the fall of 2011 when a national memorial to Dr. King had just been dedicated on the National Mall in the United States. Are you following?
Yes.
Okay. And it had been on my mind as I read the news coverage that, wait a minute, am I misremembering Dr. King? They were talking about the I Have a Dream speech over and over again, but only small pieces of it. The piece where I hope that someday my daughters will be judged by their character, not by the color of their skin, and they can hold hands with little white girls and black girls. But none of the really strong messages that would require us to do something. So I've been thinking about that. So when the opportunity arose to write a short book, I knew immediately that that's what I wanted to write. So it's not that I'm an expert on it. It's just that I was thinking, somebody needs to write this. And when you start thinking somebody needs to do something, and it's not happening, eventually you say, okay, well, I guess I may as well try it. So that's what I did. And I do want to say that I'm sure it will be received in some quarters as very critical and unpatriotic, but I want to make sure that I emphasize that I write it as a very patriotic and concerned citizen. You'll notice that I'm wearing red, white, and blue. And I spent many years in West Africa and in Central Africa, years that were very challenging and rewarding. But at a certain point, I asked myself, oughtn't you to go home and face the music and dance? And there are things that need to be attended to in the United States. And I felt sort of an obligation to go back. So that's why I took on to write this book. So I wanted to, can you go back again to the cover? So this is not necessarily the cover that Indiana University will present, but this is the one I proposed. I took this photograph, and I'll tell you something about it. This is a monument, Yeliman Fall has been there, a monument to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who got his PhD at Boston University. This is at Boston University where I work every day. And I thought it was very interesting to have this photograph, because it's a beautiful monument of birds taking flight with the American flag flying in the background. So I proposed that. Who knows what that is? But that's why that cover. So basically what I'd like to do in the time that remains, and then leave a lot of time for discussion, because I think that I'll learn a lot from you, is to just present the basic outline of the book. So if you go to the first slide. So this is the general outline of the book. I wanted to say a couple things about Dr. King before I go through the book, though. Dr. King was an intellectual and a philosopher, and he was certainly one of, and I would argue the most, influential intellectuals of the 20th century. Although we seldom remember him as such. We're usually thinking of him as an activist, civil rights organizer, which he was. But he was also an exceptional scholar. He graduated from high school at age 15. He graduated from Morehouse College with a degree in sociology a couple of years later. 3 years later, he earned another bachelor's degree in divinity at Crozer Theological Seminary, and at age 25 he had completed his PhD at Boston University School of Theology. He was a gifted, he was a prolific writer, and most of his writings are actually available online, which is wonderful. And he was a gifted orator. But again, I want to underline his role as a major thinker and theorist, because I think that that's part of the misremembering, is that we don't remember that part of him. That he really was a major influence on thinking. Another thing that we often don't remember about Dr. King is that he was an internationalist. He's remembered as a civil rights activist in the United States. But actually, he was extremely concerned with the situation in the United States, but as part of the larger world. And he was constantly looking at the issues of militarism, issues of poverty, and the issues of racism in their global political context. So while most of his work took place in the United States, it was for him part of a much larger picture. And I pulled a few quotes today from, you can pick almost any speech of Dr. King's and you can read it over and over and over again and find so much in it. I know that my colleague, Babacar Ndiaye, shares that opinion. So I just took a few quotes from his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize in 1964. And you can see these, you can see that he's really very much of a thinker, and you can also see that he's putting things already at that point in a very global perspective. I just wanted to read this quote, although it's a bit long, and I certainly am not the orator that Dr. King was. But let me read this just to emphasize this internationalist perspective. All that I have said boils down to the point of affirming that mankind's survival is dependent on man's ability to solve the problems of racial injustice, poverty, and war. The solution of these problems is in turn dependent upon man squaring his moral progress with his scientific progress and learning the practical art of living in harmony. Some years ago, a famous novelist died. Among his papers was found a list of suggested story plots for future stories, the most prominently underscored being this one. A widely separated family inherits a house in which they have to live together. This is the great new problem of mankind. We have inherited a house, a big house, a great world house, in which we have to live together, black and white, Easterners and Westerners, Gentiles and Jews, Catholics and Protestants, Muslims and Hindus, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interests, who, because we can never again live without each other, must learn somehow in this one big world to live with each other. And in that same speech, he spoke a great deal about Africa. At the time, the liberation movements were really transforming the face of the continent, and made that part of his vision of a more just world, seeing the end of colonialism, and really believing that a new world was possible. And it is possible. That we haven't made it doesn't mean that it's not possible. So those are two aspects that I wanted to emphasize that seem to be forgotten, at least in our popular memories of Dr. King, is that he was talking about the world. And if he talked about racism, it wasn't as if racism only existed in the United States. He could see clearly that the relationship between the West and the continent of Africa was also part of this racist system. So, the way I've organized the book is to, there's an introductory material about Dr. King, about the idea of memory and forgetting, what does it mean, a little bit of a theoretical background. And then the first part of the book is about what we remember, and gives a little background on Dr. King, and particularly the two things that we do remember about Dr. King in the United States are his role in the civil rights movement. Those are the images that we see. We see images of him leading civil rights marches. We don't see images of him in anti-war marches, and there are images of him. We don't see images of him in Watts after the urban uprisings there, decrying the horrible economic situation and police brutality that was the cause of this. We don't. Those simply are not in the public or popular discourse, although they can certainly be found. So civil rights, but very narrowly construed. First, for Dr. King, I believe that civil rights was a human rights issue. It was part of a much larger question. It wasn't simply a question of African Americans having civil rights in the United States. That was a case in point of a larger issue of people having human rights. The other thing that he is remembered for is nonviolence. And he was a student of Gandhi. He was very much committed to nonviolence. But one of the interesting things that I discovered while preparing this book is that when he was first appointed as the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was the organization founded through the NAACP that led the Montgomery bus boycott. Lillian Smith, a writer, novelist, you know Lillian Smith, suggested to her friend Bayard Rustin, who is African American, a really important organizer and activist, that but his background, he was an African American Quaker. The Quakers are known for, at center of everything is nonviolence. And he had been a conscientious objector during World War II. He had gone to prison because he did not care to serve in the military. Anyway, this was a friend of Lillian Smith's, and she said, I think maybe you ought to go down to Montgomery and meet with Dr. King and his associates. So when Bayard Rustin first arrived there, a lot of these people were armed because they were being threatened on a regular basis. And Bayard Rustin convinced them over a period of time to really put nonviolence at the very center of their work and to get rid of their arms and really be a force. He saw this as a very strong force for nonviolence. So it's sort of interesting to me that while we remember Dr. King so much for his nonviolence, that this wasn't necessarily, he was theoretically involved in nonviolence, but he wasn't practically involved in it until that point. So I pulled another quote from the Nobel acceptance speech about nonviolence. This is not in the book, but I thought it was of interest. Violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral. I am not unmindful of the fact that violence often brings about momentary results. Nations have frequently won their independence in battle. But in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence is impractical because it is a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. It is immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It seeks to annihilate rather than convert. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society in monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends up defeating itself. It creates bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. And I would actually repeat that last sentence. It creates bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. I think that Dr. King's message about nonviolence is extremely important. And fortunately, it is one of the things that he's remembered for, but not enough, I would say. So the second part of the book is called What We Forget. And this is the part that I really wanted to emphasize. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details because I think most of you already know this. But I've written this for a general audience. It's not an academic work, and it's not for people who already are convinced. But there are a lot of Americans who really don't remember Dr. King, or they misremember him by only partially remembering what he stood for. And so, as we've come upon this time of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, when he made his address, the I Have a Dream speech, and as we come up on the national holiday, which we have in the United States in January for his birthday, I'm hoping that it might just serve to remind people, make them think about him, because this is a very propitious time to be thinking about his message, because it's, as I said, the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So, Dr. King spent a lot of time writing about what he called the giant triplets, sometimes the three great evils. And for him, oh, actually, I'm sorry, I haven't been asking you to pass the PowerPoint. Can you advance the PowerPoint? Okay, this is, and now I'm going back to this. This is just the epilogue for the book. A civilization can flounder as readily in the face of moral and spiritual bankruptcy as it can through financial bankruptcy. A quote that I thought was quite apt at present. We're going through, in the United States and the world is going through a real financial crisis. And to what extent can we trace that financial crisis to a moral and spiritual crisis? Okay, can you, next? Okay, next. I talked about that. Next. Okay, so this is the next part of the book, what we forget. Next. Okay, so there are 3 points that he emphasized over and over, and this is how I've organized the book, because what I'm looking at is, what did he have to say? We say in the United States that we honor Martin Luther King Jr. We have a holiday in his name, we have a memorial on the National Mall, but do we really honor him when we don't remember any of this? We've sort of put it under the table. And why? I think because we really haven't made much progress, and in some cases we've gone backwards in these matters. And they're not comfortable. So the first thing he talked about, which is related to nonviolence, is militarism. He was very, very critical of the tendency of nations to engage in war, kill each other off, wound each other, be the cause of epidemics, refugees, internally displaced people, ruined infrastructure. Now, a general thought about Dr. King is that he only started talking about that in the context of the escalation of the war in Vietnam, which he was a very outspoken critic of. But in fact, if you look back at his work, in a 1957 speech that he gave, he was already talking about militarism. So it wasn't something that came late in life. And I think that the promoting this idea that he only started talking about it late in life is a way of sort of belittling him. Oh, he just started talking about that later. You know, he wasn't really concerned about it, but he was from the very beginning. So, in this particular chapter, I look at what's going on now, and particularly vis-a-vis the United States. How are we comporting ourselves? To what extent have we paid attention to what he had to say? He was very critical. He was very critical of the Vietnam War because he saw what was happening there. First of all, he saw it as racist. He saw it as a misuse of resources, because there were so many problems at home, and yet we were spending huge amounts of money to go and wage a war far away. Well, things aren't too different right now. So he saw it, and he found it difficult to preach nonviolence to people in the cities that were erupting in violence because of untenable conditions that could have been attended to with the monies that were being invested in wars. The second giant triplet that he talked about was materialism. I think maybe it's easier to see materialism as poverty. So basically he was talking about economic disparities and communities and polities that allow great disparities. So he was very disturbed by the fact that there were some people who were doing very well, and there were others who were really, really struggling, and that there wasn't more effort to evenly distribute resources among the community. And it's very interesting because following his death, there were actually a number of changes in U.S. policy that led to a much more balanced distribution of resources during the 70s. That completely reversed in the 80s, and now we are in a situation that's much, much more severe than when he was alive. He was very concerned that this is not just a personal issue, but as he said, true compassion is more than flinging a coin at a beggar. True compassion is destroying the edifice that creates beggars. And that's what he invited us to do. And a lot of the legislation, as I said, that passed during the war on poverty in the 70s actually made a big difference. But it's being rolled back. Also, when he talked about materialism, he looked at international relations. immigration. So he wasn't only looking within the United States, but he was looking at the way that US and other companies operate in Africa and other parts of the world where they're not investing in the communities, but they're simply taking out the profits. And he was very critical of that. Again, the driving force of materialism, gathering things, gathering money, being more important than creating community. Finally, and this is the one that I actually write about the most, this is the thing that I feel like I know the most about, is racism. And we think of Dr. King in terms of racism because of civil rights, but we don't think of Dr. King in terms of the debate on reparations. Reparations being the repair of past damage. But in fact, he was a great proponent of reparations. He didn't call them reparations, but he said, you know, a nation that has done something special against the Negro for centuries now needs to do something special for him if he's to compete on an even playing field. So he was looking at how he was advocating for huge investments, massive investments in communities, for education, housing, job creation, health care, for communities, African American communities that had been really excluded, not only from the ballot box, but from other social goods. In fact, he at one point said, you know, it's great that we have these civil rights advances, but it's not, and this was echoed by President Obama recently at an address to the NAACP, I think in 2008, when he said, you know, it's great to be able to sit at the lunch counter, it's like a little cafe, but what difference does it make if you don't have any money to buy the lunch? So in some ways, this, the work for civil rights was good. It passed laws. It made a lot of the racist laws, racist practices illegal, but it didn't make them non-existent. And also, something that we really don't remember, at least not those of us who are white, is that Dr. King really called out the white community. He really called us out. He said on a number of occasions, you know, white people just, they'll only go so far. You know, you're willing to give us the right to vote. But if it's going to cost you something, you're not going to do it. And his contention was that to really achieve racial justice in the United States, it was going to cost a lot. And it's going to cost a lot more now than it was then. But he was convinced, and I think we all can be convinced, that you just have to pay the price. We can pay the price if we put our priorities there. If we don't, then it means we don't want to pay the price, which was his contention, that white people had a lot, they talked the talk, but they didn't really walk the walk. And he was especially critical of what he called liberal whites, who were, you know, very supportive of the civil rights movement, and right in there, but when it came to changing their way of life, or giving up some of their advantages, then they sort of disappeared. So a lot of what those are the kinds of messages that I think are really, really hard for people in the United States to hear. We like to take credit for remembering Martin Luther King Jr. because that means that we're really not racist anymore, because after all, we have a holiday for Dr. King, we have a national monument. How could we possibly be racist? But I think that, in fact, we are extremely racist because we don't do him the honor of actually paying attention to what he had to say. And it's hard to listen to what he had to say. But he was a very prophetic voice, and I think it's so important that people face it. And as he said, he said, you know, you really have to face it. This is taken from his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And that was my major source, although there are like I said, he was a prolific writer. Anyway, here's what he says. There must be a recognition on the part of everybody in this nation that America is still a racist country. Now, however unpleasant that sounds, it's the truth. And we will never solve the problem of racism until there's a recognition of the fact that racism still stands at the center of so much of our nation, and we must see racism for what it is. It's really there's really an astounding level of denial about racism in the United States. It's really astounding. And unfortunately, the recent developments, having elected Barack Obama, the first African American or black president, and the rise of a number of high-profile African Americans, has led some to the belief, to the conclusion that, well, it's really fine. I mean, in some circles, I mean, for example, in the circles that we travel in, it's really sort of a non-issue on a personal level. But what that hides is that sort of a veneer on the top of society, which is what Mumia Jamal put as a multiracial ruling class. So there's a certain level at which the society is pretty multiracial, but when you look deeper, you see that racism is really running rampant throughout the society. And in two ways that it's happening is through the production of poverty. I mean, there are practices and customs, it doesn't have to be law, practices and customs that have been in place, and they keep morphing a little different as time goes on, that really assure that if you look at the aggregate, African Americans are much worse off than the general population of white Americans. There are lots of exceptions, but those exceptions don't change the fact that the society is organized in such a way that it really disadvantages a whole group of people. And it's not as if it's, you know, people are sitting down thinking, well, how can I make sure that I get all the goods and they don't? It's a product of history. It's a system that really hasn't really been dismantled. And it won't be dismantled, as Dr. King said, until white people do something about it. African Americans have been talking about it since day one. But it's really the job of white people to see that this is a system that not only, we tend to look at it, oh, that really disadvantages the African Americans. Oh, that's so sad. Why, that's too bad. What a pity. You know, they're living in the ghetto, and so many in prison. Oh, it's just too bad. So we're focusing really on them, but we're not thinking of where that system came from, and the fact that it's been inherited from a system that was designed to make sure that the goods were with a few white men. Now it's expanded a bit. But the fact of the matter is, people are reluctant to even address the racism. It's really almost a taboo term among white people. And there's an immediate reaction which is, oh no, but I'm not a racist. It's my best friend. Best friend. I'm not a racist. But not understanding, well, that's not what Dr. King was talking about. He didn't really care if you were nice to him. He cared about opportunities for employment. He cared there was a long history that ended up with with huge concentrations of African Americans in major cities, in ghettos, and that's still the case. You know, there were restrictions on housing, restrictions on jobs, public transportation that didn't get people to their workplace. It's a very, very complex system, and until people are ready to look at it as a system and think about, what can I do to change the system? It doesn't really matter if you're, I mean, it's nice to be nice to people, and we expect that there to be a certain amount of compassion and good feeling between people, but that's not what it's about. It's about a system, and the system works, the system will keep working until people stop it. So you can be really nice to everybody, and that will not change it. And that's what I think people are, white people especially, are unable to comprehend. the minute we hear the term racism, we think, oh, no, not me, I'm not racist. Please, please. And then you're lost. But if we could start to look at it as a system, and a system that we do have the capacity to change, everybody has the capacity to change. In this course that Dr. Sen mentioned, White People Challenging Racism, each person in the course, over the course of the course, develops a plan. First we start looking at all the institutions that we're part of. So do you have a bank account? Do your kids go to school? Do you go to church? Do you go to synagogue? Do you go to mosque? Oh, do you take the train? Do you go to the public library? And start looking at those. So choose one. So say you have a public library in your town. Who's there? Who's the librarian? What people are represented? What are the books there? And then you can start to look at the institutions and say, okay, well, I guess I could go to the library and ask them if they could acquire more books by African American or Caribbean, African authors. Maybe I could ask them to have a talk by, a visiting scholar. There are ways that you can try to change at a very low level that sort of then fan out. So he was putting a big challenge to us, and it's really too bad that we can't understand it, and that we just go, oh, no, oh, not me. So to back up a little bit, I said that the two ways that I think, the two major ways right now that racism is operating in the United States are production of poverty. If you look at any major indicators, housing, education, income, the wealth divide is huge between African Americans and whites. Not individuals, but collectively, aggregate data. And why? Well, 150 years ago, about 4 million people were suddenly set loose with no land, no money, no assets. And then shortly thereafter, practices and laws were put in place to make sure they didn't get any. And this accumulates over time. There has to be a compensation, as Dr. King said, a nation that's done something special against the Negro for centuries now needs to do something special for him. And I think that's what affirmative action was doing, but that's become, that's been struck down in so many cases. So this production of poverty is one thing. The other thing that's really mushroomed over the last few decades is the production of prisoners. It's really sort of under the radar of a lot of people, but the United States now has the greatest proportion of prisoners in the world. That is to say, we incarcerate people at a greater rate than any other country in the world. And a large portion of those incarcerated are black. Part of this is due to the war on drugs. A lot of it's due to disparate police surveillance. If you live in a poor neighborhood and the police are at liberty to stop you, frisk you with impunity, then you're more likely to get arrested. It makes me think of a case that happened several years ago that really amazed me. It was a woman, just a single mom. She was living in a high-rise, not a high-rise, but an apartment building in a really poor community. And she had a baby, maybe 3 years old. And, it was late at night, maybe 11 or 12, and she'd gone down the hall to spend some time with her friend. She'd probably been working all day. And the baby was sleeping, so off she went. And then the baby woke up and was looking out the window or hanging out the window. And because there were police patrolling all over the place, she was arrested and her child was taken away from her. Now, if I did the same thing in my neighborhood, there aren't any police patrolling, and no one would think of, taking away, I don't think, taking away my child. There just isn't that kind of surveillance. Anyway, she got her child back, but it was really horrible. And it was really because there was more surveillance. It wasn't the different behavior, it was just different standards being applied. So another aspect of this production of prisoners is that drug charges are felonies in the United States. I don't know how to translate that. les crimes majeurs. Yeah. Once, in many, many states, once you have been accused of a felony, sentenced and done time for a felony, you will be forever branded a felon and you will not be able to vote ever again. So it's very interesting. See how these things are very complex and intertwined. So in fact, a lot of African Americans, the proportion of African Americans in prison has no relation whatsoever to their proportion in the population. It's way more. In fact, 1 in 3 black men can expect to spend some time under the supervision of the criminal justice system in the United States. 1 in 3. But at the same time, another way that this operates is that it strips a lot of people of voting rights. So before, there were special grandfather clauses, literacy tests, there were all kinds of methods of keeping African Americans from voting. Now, well, they're felons, can't vote ever again, done. So a lot of people have been excluded from voting that way. It also has a very toxic effect on communities because if your brother is in prison, it's not just your brother that's suffering. The whole community is suffering. To make a phone call to a prison costs way more than to make a normal phone call. The phone companies make a special cut on that. You have to pay for lawyers. You have to pay, once you come out, you have to pay your probation officer. Now, it used to be illegal in the United States to use prison labor for anything but making, you know, les trucs de matriculation pour les voitures, quelques meubles pour le gouvernement. But I think it was in the 70s or 80s, so new laws were passed. Oh, also, labor unions would never allow that because it would be unfair competition. But labor unions have really been pretty much destroyed in the United States. And at the same time, private industry is using prison labor a lot. I mean, you often find companies that you buy, it was made in a prison. People who are making airline reservations, credit card companies, they're using prison labor and they're paying them very little. I remember, this was some time ago, this was back in the 90s. I was editing a newsletter on women in prison, incarcerated women. And at the time, my husband was working as a software engineer, he still does. And he had received these newsletters. And on the front page of one was this whole thing about prison labor. It said, you know, pros and cons of prison labor. Well, you know, they're not going to get up and go to the bathroom every few minutes. But the danger is they might be released anytime. And it's become very, very common. So, let me get to the conclusion. Can you get to the next one? I'm afraid I haven't followed this at all. Wait, back. Can you go back? Back. Okay, so this is the last chapter, why it matters. So the last chapter is divided into 2 parts. Why it matters, and white America's special responsibility. And this part is really, I've already mentioned this bit, about the special burden on white people that, you know, if we're really serious about heeding what Martin Luther King Jr. said, and if we're really serious about saying, oh, I'm not a racist, then we would actually do something about it. So this chapter is basically about, you know, why I think that we have been so reluctant to do anything and what it might take to do something. And then the final chapter is simply about why it's important for all of us. I mean, this is particularly directed to people in the United States, but it's larger than that. I mean, it's important for all of us. It's a challenge for all of us to really go back and pay attention to what he said. And since he's a hero, not only in the United States, but around the world, it behooves all of us, I think, to really look back at his work. Because, like, we could really use it right now. all the things that he was a very prophetic voice, all the things that he talked about are still, unfortunately, so pertinent. So I think I will close there. So you get the gist of what the book is about, and I'd be interested to hear if you have any comments, because as I said, I think this audience probably knows more about Dr. King than audiences that I'm likely to address at home. So thank you.
On travaille le modérateur rapidement pour dire à Jennifer qu'elle a peut-être une tare congénitale, elle fera de grandes choses, mais elle va toujours dire « Ah, c'est pas grand-chose ». Vous voyez, elle a écrit ce livre-là, et elle dit « Oui, mais il n'y a aucune prétention académique ». Et pourtant, Jennifer, après t'avoir écouté, je vois au moins 5 sujets de mémoire de maîtrise ou de thèse.
Mais je ne les ai pas écrits.
Je sais, oui, mais non, c'est-à-dire que tu inspirerais. Vas-y. J'ai bu la moitié du café.
Ça va, c'est
bon,
le partage.
je vois déjà 5 sujets de mémoire ou de thèse possibles pour les étudiants qui sont là. The Forgotten Legacy of Martin Luther King, et le livre est de ça. The Lost Three Messages of Martin Luther King, c'est une modélation autour de la même préoccupation. La signification de la prison dans la société américaine. Vous ne savez même pas pourquoi vous avez toujours vos pantalons là qui traînent derrière.
Ah oui.
Quand vous allez en prison, on vous retire la ceinture. Si on vous retire, parce que si vous gardez la ceinture, vous risquez de vous pendre. On vous enlève ça et vos pantalons traînent derrière et vous en faites une mode. Vous avez vu tous ces lutteurs là qui se présentent toujours avec des slips qui sont jaunes. Peut-être ça sent mauvais. Voilà, ils ne le savent même pas. C'est ça. Chaque fois que je vois ces slips d'or là, ils ne savent même pas. D'abord, ce n'est pas esthétique et ils ne savent pas ce qu'il y met. Mais justement, que signifie la prison? Dans la mesure où aux États-Unis, certaines personnes éprouvent de la fierté à dire I did time, my friend, I did time. C'est-à-dire, j'ai fait la prison. C'est un peu comme ces apprentis révolutionnaires des années 68 qui étaient très fiers de se faire emprisonner par Senghor et de venir parler de Mao, parler de Lénine en disant j'ai fait la prison. Et alors tout le monde les écoutait avec beaucoup. Mais là aussi, if you do time dans votre quartier, on vous respecte. Et certainement s'il y a des gangs, vous avez un gang leader. Pendant que j'y pense, allez, lisez un peu Edgar Whiteburn, John Edgar Whiteburn, c'est un professeur d'ailleurs qui vient de la zone de Boston, Massachusetts. Il a écrit un roman, son frère était prisonnier alors que lui il est professeur d'université. John Edgar Whiteburn, W-I-D-E-M-I-N. Voyez un peu, enfin j'ai une majorité d'étudiants ici, c'est pour ça que je vous donne l'information. Donc, la prison, ce que ça signifie aux États-Unis, c'est très intéressant. Ce n'est pas nécessairement la même chose que chez nous. Mais la prison aussi, comme elle peut être manipulée ou utilisée par le système, et à partir de ce moment, vous avez un autre sujet possible, ségrégation institutionnelle, et la ségrégation institutionnelle et ses subtilités aux États-Unis. C'est-à-dire, on prend les institutions, on les détourne subtilement de leurs objectifs pour les utiliser à mieux dominer. C'est un peu le affirmative action. Elle l'a dit, on vous libère il y a 200 ans. On dit vous n'êtes plus des esclaves. On dit le maître, vous n'avez plus de maître. Mais vous commencez avec quoi? Vous commencez avec rien du tout. Zéro pointé. Vous êtes dans le sud. Vous avez toujours été un agriculteur ou un ouvrier agricole. On vous libère, on vous dit maintenant vous êtes libre. Mais vous n'avez pas 1 mètre carré à cultiver. Vous retournez donc chez le maître et vous devenez en fait une sorte d'esclave non déclaré parce qu'il va vous payer les biens. Ou bien alors vous montez au nord, migration north, vous l'avez appris, mais vous commencez à Chicago avec rien du tout. C'est pour ça que très souvent aussi, vous devenez des gangsters et vous vendez de la drogue, parce que c'est la seule solution. Donc, et le 5e, you know, the issue of what, parce que tout ce qu'elle a dit là, c'est ce qu'on appelle aux États-Unis white privileges. Les blancs semblent avoir des privilèges dans la société américaine. Comment ça fonctionne? C'est quoi ça? Je n'ai jamais entendu parler de black privileges. Mais white privileges, ça existe. C'est quoi ce système-là? Donc, et puis aussi, elle l'a dit, je crois qu'on doit te remercier de ta sincérité tout au long de l'été. Cette hypocrisie, hein? Oui, bon, moi je suis un libéral, je ne suis pas raciste. Vous faites une réception, la moitié de vos invités, ou le tiers, c'est des noirs, c'est des faire-valoir. Est-ce que le fait de ne pas être raciste, vous allez le pousser jusqu'à vous débarrasser de vos privilèges? Si je ne suis pas raciste, je refuserai d'être traité comme blanc avec tous les privilèges qu'on a avec. Mais je dis oui, je suis avec eux, mais en même temps aussi, je bénéficie énormément du fait que ma race est une sorte de carte d'identité qui m'ouvre toutes les portes. Et c'est ce qu'elle a voulu dénoncer. C'est extrêmement important et j'apprécie hautement. Hein? Donc tu vois, ton travail a une vocation et une prétention tout à fait académiquement grande. Hein? Alors, très rapidement, vous avez vu, je n'ai pas besoin de résumer véritablement. Ce qu'on a ici, c'est quelqu'un qui nous dit que Martin Luther King a eu un message, ou des messages pour nous. Le message dont on se souvient le plus, c'est I have a dream, la ségrégation. Mais son discours n'était pas tout simplement un discours axé sur la ségrégation. Si c'était ça, ce serait un discours confiné à la situation américaine presque exclusivement, ou à la situation américaine et sud-africaine. C'est extraordinaire d'ailleurs que ces deux-là, Martin Luther King, je veux dire Nelson Mandela, aient eu comme source d'inspiration Mahatma Gandhi, qui a grandi en Afrique du Sud, ne l'oubliez pas. Mais ce n'est pas seulement que de la ségrégation, il y a d'autres éléments qui l'ont intéressé. Et ces éléments-là, qui sont fondamentaux dans le discours de Martin Luther King, Jennifer nous les rappelle sous forme de triptyque. Il est intéressant que ce triptyque-là, c'est sous forme de threeism, racism, materialism, militarism. Ces trois ismes-là sont une sorte de trépied qui est fondamental dans l'héritage qu'on devrait avoir de Martin Luther King. Malheureusement, on oublie souvent ça et on met le primat sur son discours antiraciste. Il faut qu'on s'en souvienne. Donc, mes chers étudiants, vous avez de la matière là. En le faisant aussi, elle nous rappelle une certaine période de l'Amérique où effectivement les Noirs avaient beaucoup de problèmes. Vous vous rappelez ce disque de Jimmy Cliff, Vietnam, etc., etc. Et vous vous rappelez certainement de Mohamed Ali Cassius Clay. Il a refusé d'aller guerroyer au Vietnam. C'était ce qu'on appelle un objecteur de conscience. C'est vrai qu'il a refusé parce qu'il faisait partie à ce moment des Blacks musulmans, mais il a refusé quelque part aussi en entendant le discours de Martin Luther King, parce qu'aller combattre contre les Vietnam, c'est aussi, ça peut être interprété, les Vietnamiens, les jaunes, comme les appellent les Français, c'est aussi une façon de mener une guerre raciste. Donc Martin Luther King s'est élevé, il y a beaucoup de Noirs. Oui.
Je veux intervenir pour le moment, parce que ça c'est une point que j'ai fait dans le livre. C'est que, en ce qui concerne, so far as militarism is concerned, there's a general forgetting in the United States of the presence of African Americans
20%.
who fought in the war against Vietnam, who are currently in. Now that we no longer have a draft, we have a volunteer army. That's changed also. But the point I was going to make is that there's a general forgetting that African Americans were very much involved in the anti-war movement. Nobody really remembers. They think, as I said before, that King just took this up later, and it really wasn't correct for him to do that. He should have minded his own business. But there were Muhammad Ali, Bayard Rustin. I mean, there were a lot of conscientious objectors and anti-war activists who were African American, but it's again something that's sort of conveniently forgotten, I think.
Donc, non seulement on les a oubliés en tant que des vétérans du Vietnam, Mais souvenez-vous, dans les 2 guerres qui ont précédé, si vous descendiez en tant que noir, si vous descendiez dans le sud avec votre uniforme militaire, avec le drapeau américain, ils vous lynchaient carrément. Allez vous faire tuer sur les fronts européens, mais ne revenez pas aux États-Unis pour dire que vous avez défendu votre pays. Si vous le faites, le Ku Klux Klan vous tue tout de suite. En revenant, une fois que vous sortez du bateau ou de l'avion, dans le premier aéroport ou le premier port, allez chercher les tenues civiles. Si vous portez l'uniforme, le Ku Klux Klan vous tue. Voilà donc ce que c'est. Bon, évidemment, mais nous allons quand même essayer de suivre Martin Luther King dans son discours. Bon, je ne veux pas dire qu'il a dit comme Jésus-Christ. Si on vous tape sur une joue, tendez l'autre joue. Je n'ai aucune envie de tendre une deuxième joue, mais quand même, faisons comme Martin Luther King et faisons comme Nelson Mandela. Je crois que c'est extrêmement important et c'est une façon de régler les problèmes de ce monde-là. Alors, il y a quelque chose qu'on a tenu secret jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Je vais déflorer le secret carrément maintenant. On aura peut-être 40 à 45 minutes de discussion avec Jennifer, mais il ne faut pas que ça aille au-delà parce qu'après, la discussion pourra se continuer. Le personnel a estimé qu'il fallait donner une toute petite réception pour Jennifer dans ce que j'appelle pompeusement les jardins du roi. Donc il y a une petite réception derrière après. On pourra continuer, mais on aura au moins une trentaine à une quarantaine de minutes de discussion. J'ouvre le micro pour tout le monde. Peut-être que Jennifer voudrait que je reconnaisse certains de ses amis ici. On a parlé de Madame Boureima. On a parlé aussi de Babacar Diaye qui est là. J'ai failli t'appeler au podium Babacar. Il y a Madame le ministre Pendabo qui est là. Il y a Madame Kanté de la Chambre de commerce américaine qui est là. Il y a notre éternel ami Becker. On lui doit beaucoup celui-là. Je voudrais qu'on applaudisse. Je ne veux pas être long, mais vous ne savez pas ce... Oui, je vais le faire, s'il te plaît. Alors là, c'est comme ça qu'on va se battre. Laisse-moi faire. Voilà. Ça, c'est typiquement américain. Il vous influence. Je vais le faire, madame. Voilà, merci. Bon, il y a Touré, hein. Je ne vais pas oublier Touré là-bas, qui a aussi fait beaucoup de choses au WAC et qui a contribué à l'animation. Il y a évidemment celui qui n'a pas seulement représenté ou n'est pas seulement l'ami de Jennifer, il a fait plus que ça. Véritablement, c'est un grand artiste que certains d'entre nous connaissent, mais la calligraphie arabe, c'est une dimension artistique qu'il faut découvrir. Et le maestro de cette calligraphie arabe, c'est Yeliman Fall, ici. Il nous a donné d'ailleurs et il est allé aux États-Unis 2 fois de suite avec des expositions. Je crois qu'il a remporté un succès extraordinaire que tout le monde apprécie. Et le Sénégal et l'Afrique de l'Ouest sont appréciés à travers ça. Et c'est un grand ami aussi de Jennifer, évidemment. Je sais que toute la salle, ce sont des amis de Jennifer, mais permettez-moi peut-être de reconnaître ceux-là, plus les étudiants, les amis de la bibliothèque, les amis de Dartre, les amis des conférences du WAC et les collègues du département d'anglais et de l'université. Je crois que j'aurais fait le tour en disant tout ça. Je vois une dame que je ne connais pas. Oui.
C'est Amy Porter.
Ah, bon, tout ça c'est la recherche et la bibliothèque. Donc, voilà, je crois qu'on va ouvrir peut-être le micro pour que les gens puissent prendre la parole et poser des questions ou faire des commentaires. Je vois une première main là-bas. Monsieur comment?
Alioune Seck.
Alioune
Seck. Considered that the civil rights movement was also something he was planning on moving to the United Nations, and he considered that as a human right case. And we tend to oppose the two men. Most of the time, we say that Malcolm X was the guy who was he was against nonviolence. He would never say turn the other cheek, but if you hit me, I will hit you back. So here we see that there is a common thing that they share. So my question is, we know that Malcolm X wanted to take the case to the United Nations, but did Martin Luther King also have that ambition to take the plight of the Negro in America to the United Nations as well? Thank you.
I don't know. It's hard to always to say how American foreign policy would have developed if he hadn't been there. Just second guessing. I think he probably made some impact on it. Not as much as he would have liked, however. And then Dr. Njai also talked about leadership. Clearly he was an extraordinary leader. Really very inspired and inspiring. And an extraordinary poet. I mean, if you just go to read his work, like I said, I was not a student of Dr. King in particular. I mean, I thought he was a remarkable man and so on. But when I started to go back and read his work and listen to it, you can hear almost all of his speeches on the web. Just amazed. You can listen to them over and over again. You can read them over and over again, and they're really very intellectually challenging, very poetic pieces. They're quite amazing. You know, I mean, there aren't that many speeches that you can listen to over and over again, read over and over again, and always find something new. So I definitely agree with him that he's an extraordinary poet. Toure had a couple questions about Americans' idea of themselves and our real sense of identity being linked to the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, all men are created equal, and so on. That's true. We're really into that. We're really into claiming that. But actually, if you look more closely, we're not that into doing it. Human beings are peculiar. You know, we can have an image of ourselves and an idea of who we are that's a little bit different than what's really going on. But I think that people genuinely, sincerely believe in these principles in the United States. I don't think there's any question about that. Most people. But at the same time, we allow a prison system that's extremely racist and it has nothing to do with all men are created equal, never mind women. So there's a sort of disconnect there. But it's definitely true that we as a national people, we really put a lot of, we invest a lot in those ideas. But there you have the difference between moving from talk to action. There's a lot of talk. You know, we all imagine ourselves in certain ways, but sometimes our conceptions of ourselves are a little different than the reality. So that's what I would say. I don't think it's insincere, but I think it's not terribly accurate. So I really don't think that Martin Luther King Jr.'s message did arrive. It arrived to some, and I think that one of the persons that it arrived to, the original title of this book was Misremembering Dr. King, The Legacy of Martin Luther King in the Age of Obama. But I actually changed it because I didn't want it to be too fixed in time. But I think that Obama is one of the people who has heard the message. Whether he is able to act on it has a lot to do with militarism, materialism, and racism. Exactly those things that are, you know, I'm not really the judge of what his underlying motivations are, but I think that he's up against a lot. He's up against a lot because he's black in a racist country. There are a lot of people who really don't want him to succeed. You can see that if you look at how the Congress is operating. He's up against a very materialist society. He continues to really put profit for a few people, banks, big corporations, above the well-being of the rest. And interestingly, even people who are not very well off believe in this. So there's a lot of resistance to sort of social programs. Food stamps is a program in the United States. So people that don't really earn enough money to, at a certain level, will be issued coupons that they can use in grocery stores to buy food. But there's a real backlash against that. There's a lot of people that think that's really horrible. Although there are more and more people who have food stamps, even people who are working. And the problem is because labor has been really destroyed organized labor, we have a lot of people working at minimum wage, which is not enough to live on. And then the taxpayers have to provide food stamps and welfare benefits. And then the taxpayers get mad at the people who are collecting. But the fact of the matter is, we as taxpayers are subsidizing these corporations because they couldn't possibly pay people those low wages if we weren't there to provide supports. So now I've lost my train of thought. So I'll just go on to another thought. I wanted to say that I think we are the inheritors of our history, and we're not obliged to continue it. You know, we have inherited a very particular history in the United States and in the world. And as people like Mandela and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and countless others have said, you know, you don't have to live this way. You can make another world. It's possible. But do you want to do it? It's not easy. It's not cost-free. And so I don't really agree that we sort of inherit a history that we are obliged to live with. In fact, I think that we're obliged as human beings to try to make it better. And then there was the question about les préjugés entre les groupes, que ça soit naturel, etc. But I'm not talking about préjugés entre groupes. I'm not talking about whether, you know, you don't like so-and-so because he's a different ethnic group, or I don't like so-and-so because he's Asian. And this is the point that I was trying to make. What we're talking about is systems of domination and oppression. So, in the United States, for example, you might go to rent an apartment, and maybe the person who's renting the apartment is white, and he's really nice to you. Sure, I'm sorry, the apartment's not available. And then your friend who's white goes to rent it, and, oh yeah, sign here. So, it's not so much these personal, that wasn't a great example, but it's not so much the personal issues, but it's being able to imagine and to see the structures, the way the society is structured, and then to think about doing something about it. Because it's not really about préjugés. People do have préjugés, but that doesn't mean they have to build their societies around them.
That's why I talked about habitus. She told you.
Yes, but there's also, I would submit that there is an institutional habitus that's even stronger. So just as individuals, this Bourdieu idea, which I very much subscribe to, of a personal habitus, institutions have that too, and it's much stronger and much harder to move because nobody takes responsibility for it, and it just keeps going. And it's so complex, so many different parts.
Inheritance of social obligations.
Yeah, and social structures, and especially if you don't know what the social structures are. If you are not aware of them, you have even less control of them. You think, oh, well, the reason that there's a lot of residential segregation in the United States, that's because people like to live among their own kind. You hear that all the time. People don't really, what is your own kind? Is your own kind people that are the same racial group? Is it people who have the same sexual orientation? People who are the same height? People who are the same age? It's that some people have been excluded from certain areas, and over time that builds up. So it's not that people like to live with their own kind. I mean, to some extent. That's what I'm saying. Don't just quote Mandela, do the work. Don't just quote Martin Luther King, because I think you're absolutely right. You know, are we doing more than misremembering? Are we misusing? And I think that's really sort of the underlying thing here, is that we're not just misremembering him. We're taking credit for his work. It's very it's very underhanded. We're saying, oh yeah, Martin Luther King, great hero. We have a holiday, March on Washington. So we don't call it March on Washington for jobs and freedom. So March on Washington. So in a way, we are misusing it. We're taking this memory and taking credit for it without really paying attention to it and doing anything about it. And I just want to make one more comment about, you were mentioning the preponderance of black males in prisons. I wanted to just point out that black women, as a proportion of the prison population in the United States, are really skyrocketing. That's changing radically. There are more and more women in prison on minor drug charges, bad checks, really sort of minor offenses, which sort of harks back to the time right after the Emancipation Proclamation, when blacks were routinely arrested for minor infractions and imprisoned. So you're seeing repeating, and that's something in terms of racism in the United States and perhaps everywhere. The strategies, the ways in which the mechanics of it change. So it seems that things have changed, but the result, the big result, is the same. So it seems, oh no, that was the thing in the past, that's different, but there's something else there now. So in spite of the changes, the end result remains very similar. So, thank you.
Une petite remarque par rapport à tout ça, parce que la langue traduit certaines choses. Il y a une expression que j'ai apprise aux États-Unis qui me fait toujours rire. C'est une expression horrible, mais chaque fois que j'y pense, je ris. Quand quelqu'un conduit en état d'ébriété, vous dites driving while drunk or while under the influence. Quand quelqu'un conduit alors qu'il est noir, vous dites driving while black. Non, c'est pour vous montrer l'habitude ou la propension des policiers américains à arrêter les noirs pour vérifier. Ils le font 100 fois plus que chez les Turcs. Donc, quand vous conduisez en tant que noir, vous courez un risque. Bon, alors, on va organiser tout ça. J'avais dit qu'à 18 h, qu'on aille faire la réception, mais on va se donner peut-être 10 petites minutes. Tu t'en vas? Tu veux dire quelque chose? Non? Oui, tu peux prendre la parole. Je crois, Berthe, tu peux aussi dire? Oui, bon, donc... Moi, je dis quelque chose. Oui, donc, attendez que je lance ça. Est-ce que vous permettez qu'on donne la parole à 2 personnes, c'est-à-dire au professeur et ministre Pendamo, parce qu'elle a des relations spéciales quand même avec Jennifer, et à l'artiste, notre grand frère Yeliman Fall, qui aussi a des relations particulières avec Pendamo, avec Jennifer. On les écoute, je conclue et on va continuer la discussion à la réception. On est d'accord? C'est démocratique? Donc je ne suis pas un tyran.
Merci Ousmane. Je commencerai tout d'abord par remercier Jennifer. Je ne pouvais pas ne pas venir parce que depuis ce matin, je suis dans des réunions et je reviens de la célébration de Mandela. Mais je ne pouvais pas ne pas passer. D'abord pour féliciter et témoigner toute mon amitié à Jennifer. Et c'est très intéressant, ça montre le côté très humaniste de Jennifer. J'ai choisi d'écrire sur ma interview, c'est très révélateur de mon point de vue de la nature profonde de ce qu'est Jennifer. Quand on connaît l'histoire des États-Unis, quand on connaît aussi la séparation entre les races, qui, qu'on le veuille ou non, se répercute au niveau de l'inconscient. Et on a tendance à avoir peur qui brise justement ces barrières et cette glace qui continue à exister entre les deux races. Mais j'ai une préoccupation par rapport à tout cela. Et moi, je le dis, quand je lis tout ce qui est fait sur Mandela, je dis, nous pouvons être fiers de nos héros en tant que Noirs. Parce que Mandela a parachevé pratiquement la libération de l'homme noir. c'est toute une lignée, Et il faudra peut-être revoir tout cela, ce que chacun a apporté, la dimension que chacun d'entre eux a apporté justement à cette longue marche de la libération, je dis seulement, pas seulement du noir, mais de l'être humain. Parce que celui qui oppresse aussi a besoin d'être libéré. Mais j'ai une seule question qui me taraude l'esprit. Quand on cite ces héros, c'est rare qu'on se réfère aux héroïnes. N'ont-elles pas produit d'idées? Ne se sont-elles pas battues?
Des héroïnes.
Des héroïnes, oui. Je pense à Rosa Parks, je pense à Angela Davis et tant d'autres. Mais on les oublie. Ce qui fait que quelque part dans la tête, la pensée, on n'est pas encore totalement libéré par rapport à cette question des femmes. Wow. Quel que soit leur rôle et leur capacité, leur possibilité, on considère que c'est un rôle ponctuel et après, on les oublie. La seule femme qui a pu échapper, à mon avis, du point de vue intellectuel, je crois que c'est Hannah Arendt. On la cite partout.
Subconsciousness.
Hein? Oui. Mais c'est exceptionnel. Et sinon, qu'est-ce qu'on doit faire avec ces femmes-là? Encore une fois, je vous remercie, mais je termine par une question qui est un peu hors sujet, mais qui a son importance. Je ne sais pas pourquoi la presse sénégalaise n'exploite jamais ce genre de choses. Mandela qui arrive des États-Unis, qui s'arrête au Sénégal, même si c'est à partir de son avion, qui lance un message.
Barack Obama, tu veux dire?
Oui, je dis toujours Mandela depuis. Oui, tout à l'heure. Barack Obama qui lance un message à partir de son avion en direction de ce qui se passe en République centrafricaine. Ça, quand même, c'est un message extraordinaire pour le Sénégal, comme il l'avait fait lors de son discours aux Nations Unies. Pour le Sénégal, pour l'Afrique francophone, encore une fois, il faut toujours magnifier le modèle que représente le Sénégal. Et je ne sais pas pourquoi ça n'a pas été très exploité par le Sénégal.
Merci, Seda. Mon cher Yeliman, quelques mots, et Jennifer, tu réponds avec quelques mots et on conclut. Yeli.
Je vous remercie, M. Sen, mon ami Sen. Quand je viens au Barque, je suis très à l'aise. Parce que c'est comme si c'était chez moi. Pour Jennifer, je n'ai pas beaucoup de mots pour parler d'elle. Mais je saisis tout juste l'humanisme dont parlait tout de suite le professeur Mbao. Je l'ai connu pour la première fois, c'était au Maroc.
Ah oui.
Pour le carrefour Sahara, où il était question aussi de racisme. Parce que le racisme, ce n'est pas seulement ce n'est pas seulement un problème de couleur. Parce que souvent les gens ont tendance à croire que le racisme s'arrête juste au niveau de la couleur de peau. Mais il y a un autre problème qui se trouve là-dedans. Parce qu'au Sahara, le problème, c'était des Mauritaniens, des Marocains, des Algériens, des Tunisiens qui étaient autour de l'affaire. Il y avait des éminents professeurs d'université, mais il y avait aussi des artistes. Parmi ces artistes-là, il y avait Yeliman, qui, dans son intervention, avait proposé les bienfaits du Alif, pour simplement essayer de réunir tout ce beau monde-là autour d'un idéal commun. J'ai dit à ces gens-là, je ne peux pas reconnaître tout de suite le Tunisien du Marocain ou du Marocain de l'Algérien ou de l'Algérien du Mauritanien, parce qu'ils étaient tous des morts. Et que moi, je leur ai dit que je ne reconnaissais pas de territoire à un mort. Le mort, il avait son troupeau de chameaux, sa tente et sa théière, plus peut-être une pipe qu'il fume de temps en temps. Donc j'ai dit, pour régler ce problème-là, n'utilisez pas des armes, n'utilisez pas de la politique, allez quelque part dans le désert, installez vos tentes, regroupez-vous, buvez votre thé ensemble à la menthe et fumez votre calumet pour retrouver la paix. Donc c'est autour de cette problématique que j'ai connu Jennifer. Et tout de suite, je l'ai appréciée. Je l'appelle souvent la grande dame, je l'appelle souvent la héroïne, etc. C'est des étiquettes que je place autour d'elle. Pour simplement dire que voilà une femme qui est formidable. Pour revenir sur le sujet qu'elle traitait tout de suite, c'est-à-dire Martin Luther King, est-ce que c'est pour les Africains? Est-ce que c'est pour les Américains? La question se trouve là. Moi, je connais un peu de l'histoire de Martin Luther King. Quand j'étais à Boston, à l'université, le plus que j'ai appris, c'est là-bas. Quand j'ai vu tout de suite le monument qui a été consacré à ça, ce monument-là, la sculpture, en fait, c'est des colombes.
C'est formidable.
C'est un groupe de colombes qui s'envolent. Et quand la colombe se déplace, la colombe peut aller des États-Unis jusqu'en Afrique. C'est dire simplement l'universalité de l'enseignement de Martin Luther King. Est-ce qu'il faut simplement le lire, il faut le magnifier comme elle a dit tout de suite, oui, Martin Luther King c'est un grand homme et tout, mais ensuite le ranger quelque part. Ne pas consommer l'enseignement qu'il a laissé ici. Je crois que ça, Jennifer a fait un grand travail ici qui suscite toute notre admiration et on la félicite et que bienvenue à ce monument de la littérature. Je vous remercie.
Merci. On laisse l'auteur répondre en...
Wrote this because this, I mean, generally consider myself very much a feminist, and there are a lot of women who have been extremely influential in the civil rights movement, in the anti-racism movement. I mean, Angela Davis is a huge intellectual who's had a great effect on things. And also, reading through Martin Luther King's work, it's still all mankind, men this, man that, he. You never see, you very rarely see any reference to women. But I realize that's partly linguistic. But still, it's very disturbing. It's very masculine. And so that sort of bugged me while I was writing this, and I actually thought of putting something in the introduction about that, but I decided not to. So the question of why I selected him is, I mean, there's the question of why does he occupy such a big place, and women who are also heroines and leaders don't. That's a good question. It's not one that I address in the book. I selected to write about Dr. King because we make there's so much pomp and circumstance around him in the United States. So we take so much credit for his being that it seemed to me a little bit disingenuous. So, I mean, your point is well taken. Finally, je parle français. Parce qu'il va là?
Ah non, je ne l'ai pas essayé.
No. Yes, Yeliman and I first met in Morocco, and it's true. I mean, that racism is certainly not limited to white people. Although in the United States, that's mostly what we're talking about. There's all kinds of other racisms operating. That's the sort of overriding one. And I love what you had to say about the sculpture. It is really a beautiful sculpture, especially at sunset when you see it, these birds just taking flight. And I like what you say about them. They can fly anywhere. And so his message is really a message for everyone, not just for people in the United States. And finally, the message of the Alif, the message of love, is really, and I'm so glad you mentioned this, because at the center, at the core of all of Martin Luther King's work is the notion of love and the power of love to transform communities. You know, a lot of people say, oh, love, that's so silly. But this is not a small thing. It's really a major thing. And when Mel King read my manuscript, he said, no, but you forgot. This is the central message of Dr. King. Love leads to compassion. Love leads to nonviolence. Love leads to sharing of material goods. Love does not tolerate racism. So I think that central core of love is really what motivated Dr. King and what he's trying to get us to see.
Donc, permettez-moi véritablement de conclure, me féliciter du fait qu'on a discuté aujourd'hui à la fois de Martin Luther King et de Nelson Mandela, et on n'a pas oublié de parler de Barack Obama. Je crois que pour le centre de recherche ouest-africain, c'est extrêmement important. Bon, je crois que aussi c'est la vocation du centre. L'autre, c'est Jennifer. Je crois qu'on peut dire que tu as quand même contribué à notre héritage et notre richesse commune, qui est le savoir. Tu as, sans le savoir, tu as soulevé, ou sans vouloir le reconnaître, tu as soulevé des questions extrêmement importantes par rapport à Martin Luther King. Je crois qu'à partir de maintenant, tu auras suscité des vocations au niveau de certains étudiants pour qu'ils orientent leur curiosité en tant que chercheurs vers d'autres éléments de Martin Luther King qui dépassent I have a dream. C'est extrêmement important. Et quand il disait ce discours du prix Nobel de la paix, je me rappelle dans mes vertes années en tant qu'assistant à la faculté, parce que je faisais thème et version, et ce texte-là, je l'ai donné à traduire. Parce que quand je l'ai lu, ce texte-là m'a posé un défi. Il y a des phrases qui étaient un peu compliquées à traduire. Je me suis dit, non, il faut que je traduise et que j'aille traduire avec mes étudiants. Donc, quand il lisait ce passage-là, je me retrouvais dans les années 85-86 en train de faire du thème et de la version à l'université. C'est un texte qui est très, très intéressant et très agréable. Alors, donc, véritablement, tu as contribué au savoir universel. Je voudrais quand même, je ne peux pas terminer sans revenir sur... On n'est pas en train de faire tes éloges, on n'est pas... si, bon, quand même les éloges, ça se mérite, hein. On fait le tag de... We praise you sing your praise. No, we sing your praise, but it's deserved. When it is not deserved, we don't do it. Mais il y a beaucoup de gens qui l'ont fait. Alors ce qui m'étonne, c'est que dans ces cas-là, mais il y a deux choses qui doivent se faire. Soit la personne donne de l'argent, ou la personne pleure. Et on n'a pas dit...
vous avez fait ça, c'est pourquoi le sensitif?
Oui. Voilà. Non, s'il te plaît. Non, voilà. Non.
Je ne savais pas que c'était moi qui prolongeais la séance.
Voilà.
Si je savais, j'aurais pleuré.
Voilà. Non, vraiment, vous avez là, non, je n'exagère pas, et je termine sur ça. Vous avez ici une personne d'une générosité extraordinaire. Je vous le dis carrément. Le fait déjà qu'elle ait déjà choisi de faire carrière dans un domaine qui n'est pas le domaine qui est susceptible de vous remplir un sac d'or, être dans la recherche, être dans le corps de la paix, travailler avec une association savante et diriger ça en tant que directeur, c'est pas là où vous avez les plus gros salaires. Elle s'est engagée là parce que c'est ce qu'elle aimait et c'est ça sa conviction. Donc cette générosité, elle est là, mais un grand respect de l'humain qui même, je sais, qui même m'énerve. On a un rendez-vous aujourd'hui ensemble. Elle habite là à Mermoz. J'habite à Fenêtre Mermoz. La personne qui a le véhicule, c'est moi. Mais vous savez, ça va être une bataille pour que j'aille la prendre. Ousmane, je crois que, peut-être, est-ce que tu crois que tu pourrais passer me prendre? Oh, Ousmane, je sais que tu as beaucoup de choses à faire. Si tu ne peux pas, je me dis, mais écoute. C'est-à-dire que pour te demander un petit service, de 8h jusqu'à midi pour qu'elle s'exprime, parce que seulement elle ne veut pas déranger. J'ai beau lui dire, quand on est, l'amitié c'est justement ce pouvoir se déranger, mais ça lui coûte de le faire d'une humilité extraordinaire. Vous avez découvert ce que ce livre vaut, pourtant quand elle présentait au départ, il fallait la persuader que ça valait la peine qu'elle présente ici. C'est ça, cette humilité-là aussi c'est ce que j'ai fait. Et le sens de la justice. Je n'ai eu aucun problème à régler des questions pour le personnel. Et Ablaï est là, ils sont tous là. Je ne sais pas s'ils sont contents de leur salaire ou non, mais quel que soit le niveau de leur salaire, inférieur ou pas, surtout inférieur, si c'est le cas, c'est parce que les moyens n'existent pas. Tout problème qu'il y a au WAC, on en discute. La priorité, c'est qu'il faut qu'on trouve une solution, en particulier pour le personnel. Vous l'avez vu vous-même, engagement pour les bonnes causes. Pourquoi donc écrire sur Martin Luther King? C'est parce qu'il croit une honnêteté morale et intellectuelle à toute épreuve. Voilà la dame qui est là, qui nous a donné ce livre-là, et qui aussi nous fait l'honneur de gérer le WAC ensemble. Et aussi le WAC, je crois que c'est aussi un don. Je suis très privilégié et très honoré de pouvoir diriger ce centre-là, au nom de vous tous, au nom de la Wara et de la Roa. Et donc, sans plus tarder, tu n'as toujours pas pleuré là.
Allez, va donner l'argent. C'est la
Oui. De toute façon, il reste encore quelques heures. C'est moi qui l'amène à l'aéroport. En tout cas, c'est moi qui l'amène à l'atelier. Donc, d'ici là, et voilà, elle peut casser le truc. Voilà. Donc, sans plus tarder, vraiment, nous l'applaudissons très fort et nous allons.